First of all, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate everybody being here and coming to talk about this story. I just wanted to say a few things about it, and then I had some questions, but I thought we could just open it up for conversation and just go however the direction of the conversation goes. This is this story came out in O'Connor's first book of short stories called "A Good Man Is Hard to Find in Other Stories." That came out in 1955. But she actually wrote an earlier version of this story, and that got published in '54. And I was actually looking through some of her letters, and so before it was published in the Swanee Review, she had sent it to the Atlantic, and she said they had held on to it for a few months before they passed on it. But in the earlier version, I think what's interesting about the earlier version is Mrs. Shortley is the main character. It's a shorter version of the story. It ends with, be right around the end of part one, except, it ends with Mrs. Shortley having this revelation, but not necessarily with her dying. And then, you don't get the whole, you don't get the death of Mr. Guizak in that story. So, she came back, she revised that. And I also think, just thinking about this story, there's a lot of similarities to some of her other stories, such as Revelation, where she's, I think, working through a lot of some of the same themes there. This idea, though, of a displaced person is kind of a fun thing to talk about right now, because there's a lot of displacement going around. In the story itself, a lot of it is, there's some biographical similarities. There was a family that had come and was living with, or was living on the farm, working on the farm in Andalusia, and that's I know I'm not going to say it right, but Maddie Siox, I'm going to put the name in the chat box. But they came from Poland. They came in 1953. That's when I think Regina was working with the priest at Sacred Heart in Milledgeville at the time, and he was part of the I want to say it's the Catholic resettlement program, and that's how this family ended up coming from Poland to central Georgia. And we found out in our earlier version there was another family that came around the same time too, to Milledgeville. And so there's definitely some biographical similarities, but there's also somebody that O'Connor was close to, one of her friends, named Eric Lankerjock. I never say his name right. But he was Danish, and living in he had been in New York for a while, and then he was in the publishing industry, and he ended up in Georgia, and so they used to always talk about this idea of displacement in some of our letters, and O'Connor even kind of thought of the idea of being away from home a lot when she first left for Iowa, when she went to Iowa City for graduate school, and that was the first time she'd left Georgia. And so I think it was, a lot of people point to the fact that there was a Polish family staying on their farm, but I think that definitely plays into the genesis of the story. But I also think there are other factors going on, and so I thought we could just jump into it and just.
Well, Catherine had a comment real fast.
Oh yeah.
Oh, hold on, it's not letting me unmute you now. This was a great plan, but it's unmute.
No worries.
There you go. No, shoot.
It's Lynn's there.
There we go. It told me that you were trying to do that, then I had to do it. So that's
okay.
what happened. Okay. And just something to the woman who's speaking before, and I put a comment in the chat. If you look at your own little box, okay, like where you are on the screen, there's like some little dots in the upper, for me, it's like upper right-hand corner. If you go there, you can find the one, it would say, I guess, start video, and that would put your face in the camera. That's how you can get that moving if it's not down there below.
Yeah,
No, I just
that
wanted
was
to
Lynn, and she's on now.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I just wanted to mention that I think the whole idea of DPs might be something that people of a certain age might realize the cultural significance of more than we do, because we have our own times. I remember one time mentioning this to my mom, and my mom would be younger than O'Connor. She was born in '39. But when I mentioned something about this, she goes, "Oh, DPs." I mean, I said something, but the story was called The Displaced Person, and she just popped in with ODPs. Yes. Like this was a thing back when she was younger. And, and she made some comments about them or whatever, but it was just definitely something that they were around, and there was this kind of this fear of them. And also, I think just culturally of O'Connor's time, it has a lot more significance to that period than maybe to us. Maybe.
Good point, Catherine.
Yeah, that's a great point, Catherine. And Monica's on here, and she could probably speak more to this. But O'Connor is a huge fan of pop culture, and she loved reading. A lot of her stories or ideas from her stories came from just stories she was reading in the newspaper or things she's kind of hearing about. So I like that you bring up the point that this had a lot of cultural relevance, especially at the time she's writing it. She's not that, it's not that long after the Holocaust. It's still in everybody's memory. And it's definitely hitting a contemporary topic for the time.
Rachel, did you want to say something, or? Okay. Yeah, Andy.
We're going to be referring to the text of the story frequently, and I wonder whether or not we have a preferred text of the stories that we're going to be discussing, so that if you say in a certain paragraph, we can turn to the page. Do we have a preferred text among us?
I think most people are either using the complete story or the American.
Okay.
So there's two versions.
Good. Okay.
All right, thanks. I use the collected works, but I also have the complete stories with me, so I can go back and forth on the page numbers. I guess my first question that I was thinking about, or first thing I was wondering, is one of the big conflicts in the story is Mr. Guizak wanting to bring his niece over. Do you all think this was going to happen? I mean, in some ways, I don't know that for $3 a week this was ever going to happen.
Cheryl, I think, has a, and then Heidi. Cheryl and Heidi.
Okay, Cheryl. Oh, Cheryl. Okay.
Okay,
Cheryl,
I think that it would have happened, and probably did happen in many cases. And I can give an example of my husband, who, by the way, is older than your mother, Catherine. He was born in '34, and in his community there was an Armenian family, and the father of this family had been in this country, and he was approached and asked if he would be willing to marry an Armenian woman so that she could get out of Armenia. And sure enough, he did, sight unseen, and she was able to come over, and her sister. And they had a wonderful marriage, raised 4 beautiful children, and who were all highly educated. So yes, I think it would have happened.
Heidi?
I was curious, in the newer book that came, Good Things Out of Nazareth, this was new to me, but in one of the letters Flannery wrote to Carolyn Gordon, it was again another autobiographical reference in that she explains how the DP is currently telling Schat, who was one of their hired men, that he can get a wife from Germany, but that he'll have to pay $500 for her. I think not only is it feasible that it would happen in the story, I think again, Flannery has a very real reference to that possibility.
Catherine? And then Andy?
Little. Okay. Well, something that when we talk about this story, when I teach it and all, and of course, people are always like, "Oh, Mrs. McIntyre, she's a terrible person. She won't quote allow this, etc." And something I always bring up, and I think maybe culturally, again, we have forgotten this, is that in the South at this time, I mean, Cheryl, I'm assuming that the relative you're talking about was white. This guy's black, and blacks and whites were, it was illegal in a lot of states for blacks and whites at this period of time, which would have been the 50s, to marry. And I find that really interesting that the legality of it isn't brought up, unless, of course, O'Connor's thinking, well, everybody knows that.
Andy, then George?
I have lived both as a Yankee and as a Southerner. And I have a sense of both cultures. I found that when I was living in Pennsylvania and Indiana and Oregon, places like that, interracial relationships were they weren't universally accepted, but they were accepted. But when I moved to the South, I found that the cultural difference was quite dramatic. I adopted a little black girl, and my white family in North Carolina was aghast. They were shocked that somebody would have a black person in his or her home. So I think while there were many readers who could understand the possibility of it, there were also many readers who would understand the shock of it in one's life.
And then I think George?
Trying to unmute George. It might be popping up to, yeah, there you go.
Okay, he's got it now. All right, George.
Yes, I guess I have a question about Mr. Guizak himself, and whether part of the sort of conceit and tension of the story doesn't revolve around his own lack of awareness of his displacement. Surely he understands that he's in a foreign country and he only has a certain grasp of the language and so on. But it looks like he doesn't understand, and the sort of agreement that he makes with Salk is an indication of this. Does he really understand not only that he's displaced, but the way in which he's displaced on this farm? And it seems to me that that's a pretty complex issue. He doesn't understand. It's not clear that he understands the character of work. It's not clear that he understands the fact that he's working so hard is being received in a way other than the redemptive way he thinks it's going to be received. So in any case, my question, does he really understand just the way in which he is displaced on this farm?
Yeah, George, that's a great question. I think, one of the things I've thought about, especially rereading this story, is how much he does not fit in. But also, it seems like in some ways he doesn't try to fit in. When, as you mentioned, the work he's doing. In some of the descriptions, it describes how he seems like he's wanting to hurry everything up. Nothing's done fast enough. So in that way, it's almost like this unwillingness to compromise a little bit. And so, you're right in asking, does he understand he's displaced? Does he try to fit in even? Is he trying to get along with other people here?
Monica has a point to add to that.
Well, what really struck me in reading it today was his absolute frustration at like the culture shock he's encountering, right? Where when he's talking to Mrs. McIntyre and he just keeps repeating, she was in the camp 3 years. Like, what don't you understand about this lady? You have food, you have a house, they're in camps. What else is there to explain? And I was really struck by his frustration in reading it today.
And he is someone who's coming from the upper middle class himself. If he came from a brick house, I mean, they don't believe it. So class-wise, he's having class displacement that he doesn't understand at all.
Yeah, I love that that's this like whole point of contention. He had a brick house, and Mrs. Shortley's like, oh, he's putting on airs like a wooden house would do, without knowing anything about his life in Poland other than he had a brick house, and suddenly that's something else to criticize him about.
George, you're back on.
Yes, thanks. I guess I just wonder, I think someone just said a couple of remarks ago that he was unwilling to recognize the situation. My own wonder is whether he's just oblivious to it. He doesn't understand the racial situation. He doesn't understand the work situation, and he doesn't understand that you don't kiss Mrs. McIntyre's hand. And there's a way in which he seems to be oblivious to almost the notion of being displaced in the way that he's being displaced on the farm. And who the one character who I think may sort of hit on it in an oblique way is Aster. Aster wants to know, well, just what does it mean to be displaced? Aster says, yeah, ain't he? So he's somewhere. So it's just, he just seems to be oblivious to the very notion of being displaced.
Yeah, is it Aster? I'm trying to find it. I think it's Aster who says that they've got different ways of doing things, in Poland, and so there's that whole you're right in the sense that maybe he's not capturing. He's used to doing things one way, and he's not used to he hasn't figured out how things work on the farm.
Andrew
do you
had
have-
another comment.
Okay.
I understand that he lived in a brick house in Poland and that he has aristocratic orientations. But with that as his background, I was shocked at how technically cognizant he was of agrarian life. He can make caterpillars and tractors and take care of dairy barns and serve the cows and be one of the most productive men on the farm. And somehow he is both and, not either or. He's both aristocratic and plebeian. He has a way of adapting that is truly sensational. It's almost as though he is transformed and becomes a part of the reality in which he has to live.
No, that's a great point. Um, you know, he's able to figure out everything. Um, you know, he's seen as this just amazing worker. One of the things I was really kind of struck by rereading it, I'm interested in kind of how they talk about language and you know how they talk about English. And so early on, there's this line where somebody says, you know, I think it's Mrs. Shortley, do you think he's going to know how to drive a tractor because he doesn't speak English? You know, and I love that idea that, like, you know, speaking English is a prerequisite for being able to drive a tractor.
Linda has something to add too.
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. I don't think the fact that he knows his way around farm equipment precludes him ever having lived in a brick house. I think that, you know, there are country gentlemen who do both. And it's my feeling we have to accept that he knew very well what he was doing on the farm, and that he was a hard worker, and he knew he had to work because he sure didn't want to go back where he came from. That's why I think he was working so hard.
I think we have Lynn and Carol.
A couple things. I think to be a good farmer, you have to be a mechanic. And I think he's a mechanic. And farming, okay, he'll do the farming, but I think he's a mechanic first. And I think the idea of fitting in, that expression, fitting in, I think that's Flannery O'Connor's reflection. She doesn't think people are like screws or cogs, that they should fit in. And many of her characters talk about fitting in. I think she's critiquing that. I don't think she thinks that people are pieces of machinery.
Yeah, well, Lynn, one thing that would support your point is that this was published in the Good Man is Hard to Find in Other Stories, and that's, you know, famously, A Good Man is Hard to Find has the, you know, the misfit, you know, and he talks about being a misfit, you know, and he breaks it, you know, it's 2 syllables, you know, and he doesn't fit in. So yeah, you know, this is not the only character in O'Connor's world who's, you know. You're muted.
A life apart from agrarian life. I think she's at war with cars. I think she's at war with machinery. And I'm remembering the one with the little girl and the grandfather. The girl wanted the lawn, and the grandfather wants to sell the land, put a gas station on it. And she laments she's not going to have the lawn anymore. And I think Flannery O'Connor it's part of her mission to get her reader to reflect on these things.
Carol?
Just in going back just a few speakers, one thing about his Mr. Guizak's identity that seems key to me in understanding him is that he, in addition to being a refugee, is an immigrant, and he has an immigrant's work ethic. So it seems to me that's like a driving value for his like behavior on the farm. And then in connection with wanting to marry his niece to Salk, that sort of intersects with the, you know, the taboo in the South of miscegenation or intermarriage between the races, and the fact that he's killed in the end, which, you know, you could argue, given that word calculated, that the tractor makes its calculated path, you could argue that that's not an accident. I feel like that shows up really well, that you could see his death at the end of the story as a lynching, and to show how that the Southern Code of Manners is so powerful because he is punished, even though he's white. I feel like he's punished as if he were black, because he's crossing that taboo, that racial taboo. So he experiences a kind of racial violence. anyway, those are two observations that I just thought of.
And then we have Andy and Catherine and Jessica.
Well, can I say something to Carol real quick?
Sure.
I haven't seen you in a while. I was just going to tell you, I really like in the Teaching O'Connor book.
Yeah, you've read it. You know where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Well, Carol teaches in New York City, and when you're talking about like teaching to a really diverse class outside the South, and you talk about like teaching with talking about race with the students, and how some say that she's witnessing culture or recording culture, and I thought that was a really cool observation to have students say that.
Thank you. Well, many of my students really are immigrants, and my most vivid memory of teaching this story is when a Polish student who was just utterly quiet jumped in and said, I could just totally identify with his work ethic, because that's what we do. That's what Polish immigrants do.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
So actually, I think George has been waiting for a few minutes. I'm going to do
Okay.
George.
Catherine, Andy, and Jessica.
Sorry. Hi, I just wanted to come back to a comment that Lynn was making about fitting in. And I think that in a way, the question, there's a kind of tacit question that belongs to the story, and it has to do with this fitting in. What does it mean? The question being, what does it mean to fit in? What does it mean to be a placed person? Mrs. Shortley is very, very concerned about her position on the farm. She's worried about who's going to be asked to leave. Who is it that's no longer going to have a place? And so the notion of the displaced person, it seems to me, carries with it that question. What does it mean to fit in? What does it mean to have a place, to be a placed person?
Yeah, George, that's a great observation. It reminds me a lot of the story Revelation, where Ruby Turpin's also thinking so much of a hierarchy and who fits in where. And so the idea of, what does it mean to be placed? And Mrs. Shortley worried about it early on in the story. She gets worried about what if there's more Polish displaced persons that come in here and they're just all speaking Polish and no one's speaking English, and the English and Polish words are fighting each other. And she becomes very worried about who it's almost like the Gwizdaks represent this real threat to the system that's already in place at the farm.
Okay. Catherine?
Yes. Okay. I found it in both books. If you got the complete stories, turn to page 234. And if you got the other one, collected works, turn to page 325 toward the bottom. And, Dr. Stoll, Mark Stoll is here. He's one of the group here. Hi, Mark. And we teach a course together at Xavier University of Louisiana, which is a historically Black university. Very interesting teaching O'Connor to a class full of African-American students mostly. And I teach it as the English person, but he teaches it as theology. So we have this kind of approach going in. And before we get into this story and other stories, a lot of times we will teach about the Southern culture at the time, and this is dealing with, by the way, with the whole idea of fitting in, okay, at the time, which is really based on the pre-war Southern social structure. Now, of course, I think that the best example of all this is seen in the waiting room as Ruby Turpin is looking and, looking at people's shoes and well, this person's trash and this person. And of course, all her conversations with her best friend Jesus at night about where the order is and things like that. But I just wanted to point again, it's on that page. And then again, toward the bottom of page 325 for this book. she being Mrs. McIntyre, she had seen Mr. Shortley turn his head with incredible slowness. So it's kind of like watching that train wreck, right? And stare silently over his shoulder. I'm pointing out the staring because we got a lot of stuff going on with eyes here. And that she had started to shout to the displaced person, but that she had not. That is a decision, right? She had felt her eyes and Mr. Shortley's eyes and the Negro's eyes come together in one look that froze them in collusion forever. And she had heard the little noise the pole made as the tractor wheel broke his backbone. And then, of course, the men go running and she faints. And what I always see there, we've got the upper crust white, where we want to call our landowner. We've got the poorer white, and we have the black. But in this moment, they're saying, but this is our South, this is our structure, and here's someone coming in trying to break the rules, trying to change things. And so what happens to that person? He gets killed. And I just think that's a really interesting commentary that O'Connor's making in that moment. And I just think it's just really, really important that she has them looking at each other at that moment. This is what has to happen. A lynching of sorts, yeah, maybe, absolutely. But again, they are all in collusion in this. And that's what I find just absolutely shocking about this story.
Yeah, I that goes back to what Carol had just said. So yes, bringing them all together in this moment, watching it. One of the questions we talked about in the earlier group was, who's at fault here? And is anyone? I mean, is there one person to pin the blame? But there's another question I think about too, which is, what about the priest's role in all this? Is he also to blame, or does he carry any of the blame in Mr. Guizak's death here?
Andy?
I have a question that's bothered me about Flannery O'Connor's stories. These stories are all told by a narrator. And I'm given to believe that sometimes the narrator is also a character in the story and does not necessarily have to voice the omniscient view of Flannery O'Connor herself. So I'd like to ask, who is the narrator in this story? And what can we learn once we get a sense of who he or she is about the way the story is being told? Okay, I think the first character in the story is the person telling it.
Well, while we ponder that, we can let Jessica slip in with her comment as well.
So I was just thinking about the work ethic that's come up a couple times, and the repeated reference that he makes to she spent 3 years in camp. And I'm curious to know how widely known it would have been that the motto above the entrance to a work camp was "Work will set you free." And so thinking about that and that kind of connection to the massive human rights violation and the kind of emphasis on productivity and that kind of work ethic, that kind of, the question becomes like, well, what is freedom? Are we supposed to believe that work will set you free means he got to come to America and work hard on this farm? Or, well, that doesn't really work out, right? Because he's killed by his work. He's killed on the job. So in that sense, is the freedom death? Is it his, we can assume, I guess, that he's a religious man, that he's been introduced by this priest. He clearly has some kind of religious connection. Are we supposed to think that maybe that's not true, that work will not set you free? Or are we supposed to think that maybe we should all just work until we die and that's the best way to go. I'm really wondering what is that kind of asking, what are we supposed to be pondering in that connection between the displacement, the work ethic, and the violence? How do those things come together? And what about our values are we really supposed to question?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something I've never thought about. The work will set you free. The work will set you free. But you're right in the sense, and I mentioned this before, but like Mr. Cuisac, they talk about he's here to redeem us, and he's kind of set up, whether intentional or not, as this, sacrificial Christ-like figure. And then it ends, you're right. He comes here, he works hard, he gets ran over by a tractor, dies a very painful death. And the last time we see he's getting last rites before he dies. And so, you're right. Like, what's the takeaway? Obviously it's a better situation working on the farm than the horrors of the Holocaust. But then if it's just to come over here and be displaced, not fit, and then ultimately get killed, what does that tell us?
Got Mark, Lynn.
I'll kick that out to other people to answer.
Yeah, we've got Mark, Lynn, and then Cheryl, and then Catherine.
Mark. Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I saw the question about the Christian message and in his death. It seems to me, because I'm a theologian and I come from a liberation theology perspective, I do see Mr. G coming in to liberate and to show that earlier George said, where do you fit? That we're not created to fit. We're created to, be ourselves and not fit in this complicated mold that the South was trying to put everybody in. That's not when you put persons in particular molds, then you're really denying their humanity. You see them as a cog. And so I think that Mr. G is a really strong Jesus figure trying to come in and say, folks, your idea that a Polish man can't marry, or an African-American man can't marry a Polish girl, that's not the way the world has been designed. And because he interrupted everybody and didn't fit in anybody's category, that's why they all kind of ganged up on him at the end. And that was, he got the same reception Jesus did, from my perspective.
Lynn?
Sorry, 1 second.
His point of view has to do with dignity. Work gives one dignity, and if you put him on a farm, he's going to work as much as he can. You put him in a factory, he'll work there. He's going to work because he derives dignity from it. He's astounded that one of the black help takes a turkey, and that the Mrs. McIntyre is not going to do something about it. And it's just part of, he thinks that they're giving up a chance to develop their humanity. And so he's just going to go ahead and do, he can't understand this structure, as you put it, or the system. He's just going to continue in developing his humanity. And I think Mrs. McIntyre says he's my savior. Yes. For better or worse. I mean, anybody who can save her money is going to be her savior. Yes.
Then we have Catherine, Monica, and George.
I had wanted to say, I actually put it on chat. I was going back to Andrew's question about the narrator, and I just remember John Hawke's essay. I think it's called Flannery O'Connor's Devil or something like that.
Yeah.
And he would suggest it's the devil because of all the mean comments she makes as narrator. So I actually kind of support him on that. I do think maybe it is the devil because I always love that attitude. I don't love the devil. I just love the attitude. That's all I wanted to say.
Monica?
Well, I put in the chat the full Teilhard de Chardin quote that her later story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, comes from, because I think as y'all are talking about that we aren't supposed to be fitting in, and even though Mrs. McIntyre says to her it's an insult that Christ was a displaced person, we are supposed to, as y'all are pointing out, aspire to Christ-like behavior and to not fit in. And so this quote from theologian Teilhard de Chardin that starts off with, remain true to yourself, but move ever upward toward greater consciousness and greater love. At the summit, you will find yourselves united with all those who, from every direction, have made the same ascent, for everything that rises must converge. And y'all know she'd go on to write a short story with that title. And I think that idea that we aren't supposed to be fitting in, we should be doing what's right, regardless of what's going on around us, seems especially applicable to the discussion about displacement and fitting in. We're supposed to be displaced because our place isn't here.
Mm-hmm. George, and then Kathleen.
Yeah. So then the question would be not so much what does it mean to have a place here or there, but what does it mean to truly have a place? And then the answer to that question, I think, may go to this world or in some other world. I mean, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. So then to truly have a place may not have to do with having a place here or in the South or in the North or on a farm or in a factory or anything else, but to have a place in some other greater sense. But I just want to say something also about the issue of work. And yes, Armite Max du Frey, work sets you free. And Mr. Guizak may have that somehow uppermost in his mind when he's on the farm. I don't know. But one of the things I do know is that in the South, even in the postbellum South, that little motto was simply not true. Work has a bad name in the South. Work does not set you free. Work is not the sort of thing that real men do. The real men were not working. It was the other guys who were doing the work. And even in the postbellum South, work does not find a place as somehow redeeming us human beings. And so when you look at the story, this is sort of shining through. Nobody wants to work except Mr. Guizak. So I think another question of the story has to do with that. Is Mr. Guizak sort of in a bad place because he thinks that work is going to set him free and set his cousin free, or something like that? I mean, so is that part of his being displaced, is somehow being in a place where work is not a good thing?
Kathleen?
Yeah.
Go ahead after George. One, George.
I was just gonna say labor in this story, like working is is a really interesting theme that keeps showing up, and so who is working, and even like, you know, Mr. Shortley, his work ethic seems to definitely drop off when he comes back, you know, for the second time, and he, you know, at that point he's just kind of plotting the whole time to stop Mr. Guizak, and so yeah, I think thinking about it in terms of work ethic and who's working is a really fun way to approach the story.
Now, Kathleen.
Oh, I just put in the comment box just the reminder that Mrs. McIntyre says at one point in her discussions with the priest that, as far as I'm concerned, Christ was just another DP, right? So it kind of goes both ways, like if Guizak's a Christ figure, right, or if it's a resistance to a Christ figure as being sort of an unwanted foreigner that you know, or that kind of idea, a traveler or a displaced person. But I was thinking about the scene again that somebody brought up with the eyes locking and the collusion, right? With the three, Mr. Shortley, Mrs. McIntyre, and Sulk, I guess, locking eyes. And I was just thinking about tying that back to the Holocaust and the role of Poland and the kind of turning the other way, you know, when the camps were being built. And I'm struck with, there's a Shoah, you know, that kind of epic documentary, Claude Lanzmann's documentary about the Holocaust, right? He interviews a lot of Polish people who were right near these death camps and says, you know, were you aware that they were building that? No. Did you know what they were doing there? No, we didn't know anything. And it was sort of like he'll show the proximity, you know, and so I think there's this kind of very interesting reverberation that she's doing, especially with the early footage of the Holocaust, Mrs. Shortley, and all the displaced body parts.
Yeah.
You know, with this kind of, I'm not sure how to work it out, but it seems like all kind of overlaid with displaced person and Christ and this kind of horror of the Holocaust and unknowing and knowing, you know, unwilling to have a revelation or be present. And so I just think that's interesting. I just wanted to tie that back in.
Yeah, Katie. I guess what's interesting, Rachel Watson has talked about this, but basically, like, all the bodies in this story, you know, aside from the fact that Mr. Guizak dies, we see all the kind of Holocaust victims show up over and over and over again, you know, in these images. And you know, that happens in Revelation too. Ruby Turpin has this, you know, vision of the boxcars. So, you know, it's something that she's clearly, you know, revisits. But, you know, I think that's interesting that they keep thinking about the horrors of the Holocaust, and yet they don't seem to have a whole lot of empathy for Mr. Guizak at the same time. Like, on the one hand, they kind of keep thinking of the trauma just in terms of, you know, the news clips they've seen without, I guess, processing exactly what this means.
I think we have Carol, then Andy, and Jessica just made a comment of O'Connor's imagery is Picasso-esque in the story.
I was just going to respond to Kathleen's comment about the sort of imagery of the Holocaust. I feel like in this story, and as well as in Revelation, O'Connor is very clearly pointing out the American version of fascism because of the racial violence. And if you like, and it starts like the story ends in violence, but it begins with like verbal violence and thinking. Like, and if you look at, this is jumping to Revelation, but just the way that Ruby Turpin thinks at night with the hierarchy of people, that is a fascist way of thinking. Yeah. So I feel like she's very gifted at spinning out a story that begins with that kind of verbal violence and mental violence and ends in with the displaced person in actual physical violence. But that I think that maybe what drew O'Connor to the imagery of the Holocaust, because she saw that very clearly at home.
Yeah, and she was a fan of Hannah Arendt, and so very interested, I think, in fascism.
Yeah, she read, I'm forgetting her book that came out like in 63.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, The Trial of Eichmann.
Yeah, and that's actually also with that book and that trial that when Americans first started talking more openly about the Holocaust, and you have this whole slew of like Holocaust movies coming out. Mm-hmm. So I think that was, but so the Displaced Person was happening before that. I think that makes it even more kind of groundbreaking.
Yeah, you're right. Because what Rachel Watson had said is that Mrs. Turpin, Mrs. Shortley, Mrs. McIntyre, she said, she's got a lot of little Eichmanns in her fiction. That's kind of, so it is funny that, that she writes Displaced Person in 54. So.
Before we jump to Andy, let's do Gene, because I don't think he's been able to make a comment yet, and then we'll get to Andy.
Yeah, I could identify somewhat with Miss McIntyre. I ran a company. We did building services. It was all manual labor. And I was very frustrated trying to get Americans to do the job. So I hired Latinos to do the job, the displaced people. They were willing to work. Americans, black and white, were unwilling to work very hard. So I can kind of sympathize with her somewhat. And also, I thought that Jesus was a hard worker, but the people around him didn't really believe the world was worth saving as much as Jesus did. So that's why I think Mr. Gusiak was sort of a Christ figure himself. Thank you.
Andy?
As we all know, there are two communities of conversation within the story. There is Father Flynn, the old 80-year-old priest, who likes to stop by and whenever possible talk about theology. Particularly, he likes to talk about purgatory. And those who are listening to him, the center of their conversation is of an unreformed church. And they often say to themselves and to one another, you are on the right track, or you have left the theological truth. Most people think this story ends with a tragedy, and that's true, but I think it is a penultimate tragedy. I think the last sentence of the story gives us a sense of the possibility of redemption, because the last sentence reads something like this, or maybe I'll just go across. Mrs. McIntyre is severely down, and 2 or 3 sentences at the bottom of the story says, not many people remember to come out to the country to see her, except the old priest. This is Father Flynn. He came regularly, once a week with a bag of breadcrumbs, and after he had fed those to the peacock, he would come in and sit by the side of her bed and explain the doctrines of the church. So it seems as though Mrs. McIntyre is being invited to experience a purgatorial life near the end of her life. And I think the end of the story gives an intimations of a salvific redemption, at least for Mrs. McIntyre.
Well, that's an interesting. It's a question I thought of. Is like one of the things that came up in the comments is the displaced person, that comment that he came to redeem us, and so I wonder what type of redemption does he bring, and by the end, is he is he the Christ figure? Is his death brought redemption for anyone? So it's that's an interesting reading. That's the redemptive ending. The priest coming to visit. She's got somebody coming and ministering to her.
I think we're almost out of time, but Linda, do you want to be our last comment?
On the thing that you pointed out where we know that Mr. Guizak is about to be run over by the tractor, and the three characters lock eyes, if you recall that part. I almost see that as an anti-Trinitarian use of something. And after the man is dead, then two men run over to take care of him, the two people on the other side of him on the cross, and yet they were complicit. I think that Flannery O'Connor is so brilliant that she can make an anti-statement and at the same time roll in something that's not heresy. And that's what makes her such an artist.
Yeah.
Well, there's still a lot of comments to be made, but and we don't want to treat Dr. Cofer like Mr. Guizak, so I think we will resign for the night. But keep in mind, in 2 weeks we'll have Dr. Jedry we'll be talking about Good Country People, and our own Monica Miller, who's here on this call, will be talking in another 2 weeks about which one? Michael, yes.
The Enduring Chill.
The Enduring Chill. So we're going to have a lot of things lined up for you, so more chances to talk. And
thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you all.
If I could get everyone waving at the camera so we can have that, share that somewhere. All right, thank you everybody.
Take care.